I want you to picture the most ordinary Tuesday you can imagine. Rain against the window, leftover pasta reheating in the microwave, socks that don't match because the dryer ate one of them again. That was my Tuesday 3 weeks ago, right up until 7:42 p.m., when someone knocked on my door and my whole life quietly split into a before and an after. I opened it expecting a delivery. Instead, there was a man standing under my porch light, maybe 60, silver at the temples, wearing a coat that looked too thin for the weather. He had my nose. That's the first thing I noticed in the half second before my brain caught up with my eyes. He had my nose, and my jaw, and the exact shape of eyebrows I see in the mirror every morning. Mara, he said, not a question, a fact, like he'd been rehearsing my name the whole drive over. You look just like your mother. I didn't know this man, I had never seen this man in my life. And yet something underneath my ribs already knew who he was before my mouth could catch up, because there was only one man on earth who could say those words to me and mean them the way he meant them. I'm your father, he said. I know how that sounds. I want to be honest with you, I didn't scream, I didn't slam the door, I didn't do any of the dramatic things you'd expect. I just stood there holding a spoon from my leftover pasta, staring at a dead man on my doorstep, because my father, Thomas Whitfield, burned to death in a warehouse fire 20 years ago. I have his photograph on my mother's mantle. I have his name on a headstone in Fairhaven Memorial Cemetery that I used to visit every Father's Day until I was maybe 22 and stopped, because visiting a grave for a man I couldn't remember started to feel like grief theater instead of grief. And here he was, breathing, blinking rain off his eyelashes, waiting for me to say something. I called my mother that night, obviously. I didn't tell her why, I just said I needed to see her, and she said she'd put the kettle on. I remember thinking, driving over there in the rain with my heart doing something violent in my chest, that I was about to hand her the strangest gift or the cruelest one. I didn't know which yet, the return of a husband she had spent 20 years quietly grieving. I was wrong about that too. That's the part that came later. Quick thing before I go further, I always like knowing where you're all watching from tonight, and honestly what the weather's doing on your end, because mine has been miserable lately. Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. Because here's the second shock, and it came fast before I'd even finished my sentence in my mother's kitchen. I said, Mom, sit down, there's something. A man came to my door tonight and he says, and before I could even finish, before I said the word father, my mother's face didn't do what a widow's face does when you tell her the impossible. It didn't go pale, it didn't ask, what did he look like? It went still, controlled, the face of someone bracing for a blow she'd been expecting for 20 years. He came to you first, she said quietly. Not who, not what are you talking about? She came to you first. That's when I understood that whatever was happening here, my mother already knew the ending. She'd known it the whole time I'd been visiting a grave that, as it turned out, had never held anything but an empty casket and a story everyone agreed to believe. Let me back up, because you need to understand the story I was raised on so you understand exactly how deep this went. My name is Mara Whitfield. I'm 33. I grew up in Cedar Falls, a mid-sized town about 40 minutes outside of Columbus, in a small blue house my mother, Diane, kept immaculate on a budget that never should have stretched as far as it did. My father, Thomas, worked as a shift supervisor at Belmont Furnishings, a mid-size furniture manufacturing plant on the industrial side of town. I was 13 when, according to everything I was ever told, an electrical fault in the finishing warehouse sparked a fire that swept through the building overnight. 3 men were working a late shift. 2 got out. My father didn't. The story had all the right awful details, the kind that make a tragedy feel real instead of like a rumor. A closed casket because the fire had been too severe for an open one. A memorial service with his coworkers crying into programs with his photo on the front. A framed newspaper clipping my mother kept in a drawer for years. Local man dies in BLLMONT warehouse blaze. A life insurance payout from Meridian Life and Casualty. I didn't know the exact number until much later, but I now know it was $480,000 that let my mother pay off our house and keep me in the same school district instead of us having to move somewhere cheaper. She never remarried. She told people for 2 decades that my late husband was the love of her life and there was no replacing him. I used to think that was one of the most beautiful, saddest things about her, this quiet, permanent loyalty to a dead man. Turns out it wasn't loyalty to a memory. It was loyalty to a lie she'd built with her own hands, and had to keep feeding for 20 years so it wouldn't collapse on both of us. I sat in her kitchen that night in the same chair I'd sat in as a kid doing homework and asked her the only question that mattered. "Did you know he was alive?" She didn't answer right away. She got up, refilled a kettle that didn't need refilling, and stood with her back to me for what felt like an hour but was probably 15 seconds. "Yes," she said. "I've known the whole time." I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it in that kitchen. 20 years of birthdays. 20 years of me crying myself to sleep at 11 years old because I couldn't remember the sound of his laugh anymore. 20 years of her tucking me in and telling me Daddy would be proud of me, while she had, I would later learn, an address for him. A phone number, an entire second thread of contact I never knew existed. "Why?" I asked her, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "Why would you let me grieve a man who wasn't dead?" "Because the alternative was worse," she said. "You don't understand what your father was running from?" That sentence is the one that sent me down a rabbit hole I'm still not fully out of. Here's something I've learned about lies that survive 20 years. They don't survive because they're airtight. They survive because everyone around them has agreed, consciously or not to ask the follow-up question. I had never asked, how do we know it was really him in that fire, because why would I? You don't interrogate your own father's death, you just carry it. But now I had questions, and my mother, to her credit, didn't stonewall me completely. She told me the first layer of it that night, sitting at that kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never drank. 20 years ago, my father wasn't just a shift supervisor. He'd also quietly co-signed a business loan with his younger brother, my Uncle Peter, to help Peter open an auto parts distribution business. When Peter's business collapsed 18 months in, buried under bad inventory contracts and a partner who'd skimmed cash off the books, the debt didn't just disappear. It landed in full on my father's name because Peter had structured the loan so my father carried the primary liability just as a formality. Or so my father had been told. We're talking close to $210,000, owed to a private lender with a reputation for handling unpaid debts in ways that didn't involve lawyers. My mother told me my father had grown terrified not of poverty, but of something worse. She used the phrase, people started showing up at the plant asking about him, and when I pushed for specifics, she admitted she genuinely didn't know everything because my father hadn't told her everything either. That's an important detail. Even my own mother, the person who helped him disappear, didn't have the full picture. She had a piece of a plan, not the whole plan. What she did know was this. 3 weeks before the fire, my father came home distracted and gray-faced, and started talking, carefully, hypothetically, about what would happen to us, to her and to me, if he simply vanished versus if he died. Vanishing meant creditors coming after her for the debt, since technically it was jointly held property, our house included. Dying meant a clean legal break. A widow isn't liable the same way a woman with a missing husband is, especially once an estate is settled and insurance pays out. I asked her point blank, "Are you telling me you two planned his death?" "I'm telling you," she said, "that by the time I understood what your father had done, it had already happened." That answer bothered me for days because it was too clean. It answered a much smaller question than the one I'd actually asked. And it left out one crucial detail that I wouldn't uncover for another 2 weeks, that my mother hadn't just learned about a plan after the fact. She had signed something. I didn't confront my mother again right away. Instead, I did something I'm not proud of and something I am, both at once. I went through the old filing cabinet in her spare room, the one she calls the archive, and half-jokingly forbids me from touching because it's just old receipts. It was not just old receipts. Behind a folder of decade-old tax returns, I found a slim brown envelope, unlabeled, held shut with an ancient rubber band that snapped when I touched it. Inside were 4 things that changed the entire shape of what I thought I knew. First, a photocopy of a life insurance policy from Meridian Life and Casualty. Policy number ML-7,734,291, taken out on my father 11 months before the fire. A policy increase, not an original policy, raising his coverage from $150,000 to $480,000. Second, a handwritten note in a handwriting I didn't recognize that simply read, "D, everything's arranged with R, trust him. Burn this after." No signature. She hadn't burned it. 20 years and she hadn't burned it. Third, a folded newspaper obituary, not the one I grew up with, but a different clipping from a paper 2 counties over, dated 4 months after the fire, for a man named Russell Aucaffer, described as a respected fire investigator with the county coroner's office, who had died suddenly of a heart attack. I didn't understand the significance of that one yet. I would. Fourth, and this is the one that made my hands shake, a bank deposit slip. Manual handwritten from a Cedar Falls branch that doesn't exist anymore. $22,000, cash deposited into an account under my mother's maiden name, dated 6 weeks after my father's funeral. I sat on the floor of that spare room with those 4 pieces of paper in my lap and understood, for the first time, that this wasn't a story about a desperate man running from debt collectors. This was a story that had a structure to it, a policy that was quietly increased right before a death, a man named R who arranged everything, a fire investigator who died conveniently soon after, a cash deposit that had nothing to do with any insurance payout my mother had ever told me about, because she'd always said the insurance money went straight to paying off the house, and it had mostly, but not all of it. $22,000 had gone somewhere else first, into an account with her maiden name on it, like she wanted a piece of this that existed outside of Diane Whitfield entirely. That's when I stopped thinking of my mother as a woman who'd been swept up in someone else's desperate plan, and started wondering how much of this had actually been hers. I agreed to see my father again, this time on my terms, a public cafe, mid-afternoon, where I could leave whenever I wanted. He was already there when I arrived, 2 coffees ordered, mine black, the way I actually take it, which unsettled me more than it should have. 20 years apart, and he still remembered. I put the envelope on the table between us before I even sat down. "Who's R?" I said. He looked at it for a long moment, and something in his face, not fear exactly, more like exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who's been waiting 2 decades for someone to finally ask the right question, settled over him. "Roland Vance," he said. "He ran a private lending operation out of a legitimate-looking title company. He held the loan your uncle signed me onto. And when I couldn't pay, he offered me a way out. He told me the fire wasn't an accident, and it wasn't set by him either. Vance had a man on the inside of the warehouse's overnight maintenance crew, and the electrical fault was staged to cover a fire that started for a different reason, destroying finished inventory that had already been reported to Belmont's own insurer as stolen, so the company could double collect. My father's death in the middle of that same fire was a 2-birds arrangement. Vance forgave the $210,000 debt. In exchange, my father would disappear, presumed dead in the blaze, and Vance would help identify a body from the county morgue, unclaimed, similar enough in build, using a compromised fire investigator to sign off on dental record matches that were never actually verified against anything real. That fire investigator was Russell Aucaffer, the man from the second obituary. He got greedy afterward, my father said. Started asking Vance for more money to stay quiet. I don't know exactly what happened to him. I have my suspicions, and none of them let me sleep well. I asked him the only question I actually cared about in that moment. "Did Mom know all of this, before the fire, not after?" He looked at me, and for the first time in our brief reacquaintance, he looked genuinely uncertain of what to say. "You should ask her that yourself," he said. "But Mara, I'll tell you this much. The plan wasn't supposed to need 2 witnesses on the inside. It ended up needing 2. I left that cafe with my coffee untouched and a feeling in my stomach like the floor had shifted 6 inches to the left. I want you to know something about my mother before I tell you the next part, because I don't want you to think I'm building her into a cartoon villain. My mother worked 2 jobs some years to keep me in dance lessons I begged for and quietly dropped after 8 months. She sat up with me during every fever, every heartbreak, every 2am panic before every exam I ever took. Whatever she did 20 years ago, she has spent every day since raising me like someone trying to make amends for something, even though I didn't know, until 3 weeks ago, that there was anything to make amends for. So when I went back to her, I didn't go in swinging. I sat down across from her and simply said, "Dad told me the plan needed 2 people on the inside. Was one of them you?" She didn't cry, which surprised me. She'd cried plenty in the days since he'd resurfaced, but not at this question. This question, I think, she'd been rehearsing her answer to for 20 years, waiting for someone to finally ask it properly. "Roland Vance came to me first," she said. "Not your father, me." I felt my whole understanding of the last 3 weeks reshuffle itself. She explained it slowly, like she was translating it out of a language she'd been speaking only to herself for 2 decades. Vance had approached her 6 weeks before the fire, not your father, because Vance needed someone to identify the body without hesitation, without questions, someone whose grief would be unimpeachable to an insurance adjuster. My father hadn't recruited her into the plan. Vance had recruited her independently, and only later did she and my father sit down together and realize they were both being pulled into the same scheme from opposite directions. Her, as the widow who'd identify a stranger's body as her husband's. Him as the man who needed to vanish before Vance's associates collected on the debt, a different, far less survivable way. So you agreed to identify a body you knew wasn't him, I said. I agreed, she said, because Vance made it very clear what would happen to this family if I refused, not to me, to you. She looked at me directly then. He said it wouldn't be hard to make sure a 13-year-old girl grew up without both her parents instead of just one. That $22,000 cash deposit, she told me, wasn't a bonus for her cooperation, at least not entirely. It was money Vance gave her specifically to handle Russell Ockhaffer when he started asking for more, money she was supposed to pass along to keep him quiet. She swears she never did. She swears she doesn't know what happened to that money or to Ockhaffer, and that within a year of the fire, Vance's whole operation seemed to quietly wind down and disappear, and she never heard from him again. I believed some of that, I didn't believe all of it. And that gap between belief and doubt is exactly where I started my own investigation. By this point, 3 weeks had passed since that knock on my door and I'd stopped being able to function normally. I took 2 days off work. I coordinate real estate closings for a title company, which turned out to be more useful to this whole mess than you'd think. Because I understand paper trails, I understand how title companies and escrow accounts and shell entities move money in ways that look boring on the surface and hide everything underneath. I started with public records. Belmont Furnishings had gone bankrupt 9 years after the fire. I hadn't known that, and it wasn't hard to find the old bankruptcy filings, which included a section referencing a 2004 insurance fraud investigation into the company itself, related to inflated inventory loss claims following the 2005 warehouse incident. That investigation had gone nowhere, according to the filing, due to insufficient surviving witnesses and destruction of physical evidence. Insufficient surviving witnesses. 2 of the 3 men working that overnight shift had made it out. One of them, a man named Curtis Byen, I found still living 40 minutes away, now retired, running a small engine repair shop out of his garage. I went to see him. I told him who I was. His face went through about 4 different emotions in the space of 10 seconds, and then he said something I'll never forget. I always wondered if one of you would show up someday. Curtis told me the official fire report never sat right with him. He'd worked that plant floor for 6 years and knew exactly where the flammable finishing solvents were stored, nowhere near the electrical fault the report identified as the fire's origin. He said he tried to raise this with an investigator afterward and was told politely but firmly that the case was closed and he should let it go, because raising more questions doesn't bring anyone back. He also remembered something the official report never mentioned. A man he didn't recognize on the loading dock that night, roughly 20 minutes before the fire started, talking to one of the maintenance crew. A man Curtis later saw only once in a grainy photo in the local paper's business section, standing next to the name Roland Vance, captioned as an investor in a title and escrow company called Vanwick Holdings. I want to pause here and tell you honestly, this is the point where the story stopped being just my family's story and started being something bigger. A staged fire, a compromised investigator, a body that was never really identified, and a man, Roland Vance, whose name kept surfacing in exactly the places you'd expect the architect of a scheme like this to hide, inside a legitimate-looking financial company, comfortably invisible for 20 years. If you're doing the math with me on how deep this rabbit hole goes, yeah, we're not even at the bottom of it yet. Here's where things took a turn I didn't see coming, and it's the kind of turn that made me sit in my car outside Curtis Byen's shop for 20 minutes before I could drive home. Vanwick Holdings, the title and escrow company Vance was tied to, still existed. Not thriving, a shell of what it apparently once was, a 2-room office above a nail salon in a strip mall, but existing, registered, filing minimal annual paperwork to stay technically active. I looked up its registered agent expecting a dead end. It wasn't a dead end. It was Roland Vance, still alive, still local. 68 years old, according to the filing, living 45 minutes from the house I grew up in. I didn't go see him myself. I want to be clear about that, because at this point I finally did the smart thing and brought in a lawyer. A woman named Priya Anand who specializes in insurance fraud and estate disputes, recommended to me by a colleague at the title company. I laid out everything, the envelope, the policy documents, my father's account, my mother's account, Curtis's account, Vanwyck Holdings, and she told me something that both terrified me and gave me the first real sense of direction I'd had in weeks. Insurance fraud like this doesn't just disappear because time passes, she said. Meridian Life and Casualty never actually settled a claim for a legitimate death. If your father is provably alive, that policy payout was fraudulently obtained. And depending on how this unfolds, your mother could be looking at restitution demands, possible criminal exposure, or if she cooperates fully and was genuinely coerced the way she's describing, a path to leniency by coming forward before the insurer finds out on its own. That last part mattered more than I can explain. Because up to that point, I'd been treating this like a mystery I needed to solve for my own peace of mind. Priya made me understand it was also a ticking clock. Insurance companies have their own investigators, their own statute of limitations calculations, their own incentive to claw back nearly $500,000 the moment they get wind that the deceased policyholder is walking around alive. If Meridian found out about my father before we got ahead of it, through a lawyer, on our own terms, my mother wouldn't just be someone who'd made a desperate, coerced decision 20 years ago under threat to her child. She'd be a defendant. I remember calling my mother that night and saying 4 words I never thought I'd say to her. We need a lawyer. She didn't argue. I think some small, exhausted part of her had been waiting 20 years for someone to finally say that. Priya's strategy was careful, and I'll be honest, some of it frustrated me in the moment, because I wanted confrontation and she kept steering us toward documentation instead. You don't walk up to a man like Roland Vance and accuse him, she told me. You build a file so complete that when you finally do talk to him or to the authorities about him, he has no room to maneuver. So that's what we did over the following 6 weeks. Priya filed a formal records request tied to the original 2005 fire investigation, which forced the county to release archived files that had never been digitized or properly reviewed since. Buried in those files was something even Curtis hadn't known about, a supplemental inspector's note, handwritten from Russell Ockafer himself, dated 2 days before his fatal heart attack, expressing concerns regarding chain of custody on dental record comparisons for the body recovered from the Belmont fire. Concerns he apparently never got to formally file because he died before his next scheduled report. Priya also tracked down Ockafer's widow, still living in the same county, who agreed to speak with us after Priya explained, gently, what we suspected. She told us her husband had come home agitated in his final weeks, saying he'd made a mistake he couldn't undo and was afraid of the wrong people finding out he wanted to fix it. She'd always assumed it was work stress. She'd never connected it to a fire investigation from years before their marriage. He'd never told her the details, only the fear. That was the piece that turned my stomach the most, honestly. Not the fraud itself, not even my mother's involvement, but the quiet, real possibility that a man had died of a heart attack under enormous stress, weeks after trying to correct a lie he'd been paid to tell, and no one had ever looked closely enough to ask why. With all of that documented, Priya made a decision I initially resisted. She reached out to Meridian Life and Casualty's fraud investigations unit herself, on our behalf, before anyone else could, framing my mother's disclosure as voluntary cooperation rather than something dragged out of her under investigation. It felt to me like handing our worst secret to the very institution with the most reason to destroy us over it. That's exactly why it works, Priya said. Companies like Meridian have entire departments built around punishing people who hide fraud from them. They have far less built around punishing people who walk in and hand them the whole story first. I didn't fully trust that logic, but I'd run out of better ideas. The meeting with Meridian's fraud unit happened on a Thursday morning in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee, with a man named Alan Kessler running the conversation from their side, measured, unreadable, the kind of person whose job is to give away as little of his own reaction as possible while gathering as much of yours as he can. Priya walked him through the file. My mother sat beside me, hands folded so tightly in her lap her knuckles had gone pale, and answered every question directly, without minimizing, without the softened version of the story she'd first given me in her kitchen 3 weeks earlier. She told him about Vance's threat, about identifying a stranger's remains, knowing they weren't my father's because she believed, reasonably, given what she'd been told, that refusing meant losing me too. Kessler didn't promise anything in that first meeting. He told us plainly that Meridian would be pursuing recovery of the $480,000 payout regardless of the circumstances, because the underlying claim was fraudulent no matter how sympathetic the coercion. But he also said something Priya had predicted almost word for word. That voluntary disclosure, full cooperation, and my mother's willingness to be a witness in any case built against Roland Vance would be weighed heavily in whether Meridian pursued civil recovery alone or referred the matter for criminal prosecution. 3 weeks after that meeting, we learned Meridian's fraud unit had cross-referenced Vanwyck Holdings against 2 other unresolved claims from the same era. Different families, different fires. A pattern Meridian's own investigators had apparently never connected until my mother's file landed on Kessler's desk and gave them a name to search around. Roland Vance wasn't a one-time opportunist who'd targeted my family. He'd built something closer to a business model out of exactly this scheme, quietly, for years, before apparently retiring from it and settling into a smaller, legitimate-looking life running his shell company. I felt something complicated when I learned that. Not vindication exactly. More like the sick recognition that our family's 20-year nightmare had been, to the man who engineered it, simply a transaction among several similar transactions. My mother had to repay a portion of the insurance money, not all $480,000, since much of it had legitimately gone toward the house and toward raising me, and Meridian, through negotiation, agreed to a structured restitution amount closer to $190,000 rather than pursuing the full sum or criminal charges against her. Largely on the strength of her cooperation and Akaffer's supplemental note, establishing the fraud went well beyond anything one grieving under threat wife orchestrated alone. My father's situation was more complicated and slower to resolve. That part took months, not weeks. I hadn't asked my father the most obvious question yet. Somehow, after 20 years of silence, after building whatever life he'd built somewhere else, why now? Why walk back into a life he'd spent 2 decades making sure stayed buried? I finally asked him over a second cup of coffee, months into all of this, once some of the legal dust had settled enough for us to have an actual conversation instead of a series of confessions. I have stage 3 pancreatic cancer, he said, without any performance in his voice, just fact. I've known for about 5 months, and I realized I was about to die twice, once for real, and I'd already died once as a lie. I couldn't let the second one happen without you knowing the truth about the first. He told me he'd spent the 2 decades under a different name in a small town in New Brunswick, Canada, working under-the-table construction and landscaping jobs, always cash, always careful, terrified for the first several years that Vance's associates, or worse, Vance himself, would eventually decide a living witness was more dangerous than a dead debt. He said he'd written my mother letters he never sent, at least a dozen of them, and that some part of him had convinced himself over the years that staying gone was its own kind of protection for us, even after any real threat from Vance had almost certainly faded. That's a very convenient thing to believe, I told him, when believing it means you don't have to come back. He didn't argue with me. You're right, he said. I let 20 years happen because leaving was easier than fixing it. The cancer is the only reason I found the courage the diagnosis forced on me. I won't pretend that answer fixed everything between us. It didn't. I spent 13 years of my childhood grieving a man who was alive, cutting a lawn somewhere in Canada, choosing silence over showing up. That's not something a diagnosis undoes. But I understood, finally, that he wasn't a villain out of a movie. He was a frightened, indebted man who made one catastrophic decision under threat, and then made 20 more years of smaller, quieter decisions that all pointed the same direction, away. Vance was never charged criminally in connection with my family's case specifically. The statute of limitations on the original fraud had technically run out for direct prosecution tied to my father's fire, a detail that still sits uneasily in my chest when I let myself think about it too long. But Meridian's civil case, combined with the two other families whose old claims got reopened alongside ours, and a separate investigation state prosecutors opened into Vanwyck Holdings' broader lending and escrow practices, was enough to end whatever quiet, comfortable retirement Vance thought he'd built for himself. I sat in on one deposition, at Priya's suggestion, mostly to see him, not to speak, just to see the man who'd spent 20 years as an absence in my life shaped like a threat. He was smaller than I'd imagined. Ordinary. The kind of man you'd forget within 10 minutes of meeting him at a hardware store. He answered questions in a flat, lawyered voice, admitted nothing directly, but the documentary trail Priya and Meridian's investigators had built, Akafar's supplemental note, the Vanwyck Holdings filings, the pattern across 3 families' claims, my father's own sworn account, didn't leave him much room. He settled the civil claims rather than risk a jury seeing the whole picture laid out. It wasn't the ending you see in movies. Nobody put him in handcuffs in front of me. But he lost the business, lost most of what he'd built off families like mine, and at 68, with his name now permanently tied to fraud filings any future business partner or lender would find in 5 minutes of searching, I think he understood exactly what kind of decades he had left ahead of him. Quiet, watched, diminished, not prison, but not comfortable either. I used to think justice needed to look like punishment loud enough to match the harm. What I got instead was something smaller and slower. A man's carefully built second life quietly dismantled by paperwork, the same kind of paperwork he'd once used to dismantle mine. My mother finished paying her restitution 8 months after that first knock on my door. She sold a piece of land my grandparents had left her, land she'd been saving, she told me, for you, someday, and used it to close out what she owed Meridian without touching our house. I offered to help, she wouldn't let me. I think in some way paying it herself was the only apology she knew how to make that didn't just consist of words. My father is still undergoing treatment. The prognosis isn't good, but it isn't immediately fatal either. The doctors are talking in terms of a couple of years, maybe more, maybe less, the way doctors always talk when they don't actually know. I see him every few weeks now. Not every day. Not the way a daughter sees a father who was always there. We're building something smaller than that, something more honest about its own limits, not a relationship rebuilt from scratch, but one assembled carefully out of the pieces that are actually left. My mother and I are still working through it too. Some days I understand completely why a 26-year-old woman with a small daughter, cornered by a man who threatened that daughter's safety, made the choice she made. Other days I think about 13-year-old me crying into a pillow over a man who was, at that exact moment, probably eating dinner in a rented room in New Brunswick. And I feel something harder toward her that I don't think will ever fully soften. Both of those things are true at once. I've stopped trying to pick just one. I asked her once, near the end of all this, whether she'd do it differently if Vance came to her again today with the same threat. She thought about it for a long time before answering. I'd like to say I'd go to the police, she said. But I was 26, terrified and holding you. I don't know what that woman would have done differently. I just know what the woman I am now wishes she had. I don't know if that's an excuse or an explanation. I've decided it doesn't have to be only one or the other. I visited my father's grave one more time, about a month ago, the real one this time. An unmarked plot Meridian's investigation eventually traced back to an unclaimed man named Walter Griggs, no known family, whose body had been used, without his consent or anyone's knowledge, to fake a death that wasn't his own. Meridian, to their credit, quietly funded a proper headstone for him once his identity was confirmed. I stood there for a long time, in front of a stranger's grave, thinking about how many people's lives get used as raw material for other people's survival, without anyone ever asking them. I think about the story I grew up with a lot differently now. It wasn't a story about a tragic accident and a devoted widow. It was a story about fear, built by a man who preyed on people already backed into corners, and carried for 2 decades by 2 frightened parents who each made one terrible choice, and then spent 20 years constructing an entire life to avoid looking directly at it. I don't have a clean ending for you. My father might not see another Thanksgiving, or he might see 5 more. My mother and I are closer some weeks and strained others, the way most real relationships actually are, not the way they are in stories that need a bow tied on them by the end. Roland Vance is out there somewhere, diminished but not destroyed, probably telling himself some version of events where he's not really the villain either. What I keep coming back to is this: the truth doesn't always arrive to fix things. Sometimes it just arrives to finally let you see what was actually happening the whole time, so you can stop grieving a story that was never true and start, slowly, carefully, dealing with the one that actually was. If you made it this far, thank you for sitting with my family's mess for the last hour. I'd genuinely love to know, if you were in my shoes, would you have wanted the truth at all 20 years late? Or would some part of you have rather kept the grave and the grief and never opened that door? This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental. If it stayed with you, remember, the people around us are often carrying entire histories we never see, and sometimes the kindest thing we can do is simply be willing to ask the harder question.